Okay, still talking about education spending. And now we are going to, if Julia, if you want to join us. I asked Julia to prepare another outlook for us. Some of with updated information from Nicole and some with some of what we talked about last week about the income adjustment. Floor is yours.
Okay, sure. Thank
Oh,
you.
actually, before we do, sorry. I wonder if it makes sense to talk about the presentation we just had rather than jumping to the outlook.
Sure. So for the record, I'm Julia Victor with the Joint Fiscal Office. Excuse me, my voice is still coming back. So Chair Kornheiser, would you like me to speak to the presentation that we just had?
Yeah, if you just have any reflections, I know that Julia Andrews had a question about inflation. Anything else that you saw that as you've been working on this?
Sure. So yeah, I think I would really echo all of Nicole's caveats and reflections that there's a lot of information in that data. And I too have only had a little bit of time to start thinking my way through it. So I think there's a lot to be uncovered there. I think that one of the interesting points that I noticed when first looking at it was that when calculating the relative change between FY24 and FY25, for most of those cost categories, the relative change is greater than inflation for the same years. So even if we are to adjust those FY24 numbers for inflation, so we're comparing FY25 dollars to FY25 dollars, we're still seeing increases over a lot of those categories. So I think that that's just an interesting takeaway. You know, how we measure inflation, of course, there's a lot of different indices. So my first pass was using NEAT because that's what is used in Title 16, but it's worth considering. I also wanted to get back to Representative Brannigan. You had asked how student body had changed in Vermont over time. While I don't have the district by district breakdown and exactly what you're getting at, I was thinking it may be helpful to show a chart that I shared in House Education last week, which shows the way that students have trended, the student population has trended across the state over time. Chair Kornheiser, should I share that on my screen?
Yeah, that'd be great.
So this was a presentation I gave to House Ed last week. And this is slide 16. Yeah, of course. So what we're looking.
Are you in the glass?
How's that? Okay.
Lovely.
So what we're looking at here are inflation adjusted dollars for 2020. So I'll start out with that. So this is not what you're going to see on the Ed Fund Outlook. I've adjusted it with NEAP inflation. So we're comparing apples to apples. These top two lines, the blue and the green, are reflecting expenditures, millions of dollars out of the education fund in inflation adjusted 2020 dollars. So the green is the total uses of the Ed fund. The blue is the education payment. Ed payment is that aggregate of Ed spending, right? So we can see that there's a slight upward trend over time, but relatively steady. These dots reflected not the latest budget information that we just looked at, but the information I had last week, which was those January numbers. So you can see that that was the latest forecast at the time. So that corresponds with our left-hand axis. This is going back to 2005. We also see on the right-hand axis and the orange line, the long-term average daily membership. So this gets to your question, Representative Brannigan, of what pupil count looks like over time. And so we see a steady decrease from 2005 to 2025. So it's sort of a visual picture in terms of education costs and
Spendings, so we could say spendings, is it going up more than what it shows there? Because we have fewer kids?
So this is showing the total ed fund appropriations. This is not showing the education spending per pupil. So I have shown that chart in here a few weeks ago, I believe, and that was upward. So when you combine the long-term ADM with the education payment to create education spending per pupil, then you would see an increase, which in large part can be attributed to the decrease in ADM and not a corresponding decrease in the education payment and uses.
That's good to know.
How is like ESSER funding factored into that? That would be in the total ed spend uses? No.
No, so this is only capturing dollars that are flowing out of the Vermont State Education Fund. So it's not capturing any federal dollars. If there were to be ESSER dollars, like Nicole just spoke about, that ran out and then were filled or replaced with state dollars, then we would see an increase in the state funds.
So might that account for the little dip there between 2021 and 4 that
Because
may have
there's,
additional other dollars entering?
I mean, that may be impacting, but because there's so many things and we're looking at these are during the COVID years, I don't feel comfortable speaking to what is causing that dip.
But there could be some other line we put there that's like other sources of funds that aren't state dollars that,
Or it could just be total spending on education.
there we go, or that.
But I don't even know if you can get that. I don't know if the Agency of Education even collects that number.
I don't know.
We just saw offsetting revenue with the line.
I just don't know if they've collected it on an ongoing basis.
So, any other questions about this chart? Okay, the other piece I wanted to add, which I'm sure the committee is well aware, but I just thought was helpful, especially if other folks are looking at the survey data. It's important to note that we can't simply add up all of the increases that Nicole showed in that spreadsheet and say, you know, these are all of the increases that we saw in FY 2025, because we're looking at increases in benefits. That is going to also show up when looking at the increases in healthcare. That's also going to show up when potentially looking at other staffing positions. So we can't just add up all the increases and say, these are all of the increases in education spending, because they all fit within each other and are overlapping. So I just wanted to add that bigger caveat.
Can you say that one more time?
Sure. So I really just I want to flag that I think maybe the first thought when looking at that type of data set is to say, well, we have all of these increases from FY 24 to FY 25 and all of these different buckets. So if we want to look at the total increase, we can just add them all together. We can't do that because those increases overlap. So those buckets are picking up some of the same information, just in different ways. So for instance, if we're seeing increase in benefits, increase in healthcare costs, those are going to be showing up in increase in benefits. They may also be showing up if new positions are added. The healthcare of those new positions is also being factored into the increase in healthcare. So I just wanted to raise that little flag in terms of interpreting the data. And I'm excited to look at it more when I have more time.
If we have more retirement and then we have more young people entering, and if those young people have families, the health insurance coverage for families vastly more expensive than for an individual or for a couple. That
I don't feel comfortable speaking to the varying, while there may be savings in some part of the equation or increased costs in some part of the equation, I think it's important to look at the whole picture. So while you have early retirees, and lower salaries, that's what's being discussed, there could potentially be higher benefits. Also, those early retirees, that's a longer time that pension needs to be paid out for those retirees. So with respect to how benefits fits into that structure, I would need to think about it a little bit more.
Outlook,
Sure,
unless you have more on the data we just looked
I
at.
don't have more on the data that we just saw. I did put together a histogram showing the,
Yes.
would you like to start with
Would
that before?
love to see that. So one of the things, sorry, I am doing fiscal committee at lunchtime has sort of thrown my entire day for a loop and might be the skipping of the lunch. What, I think. One of the issues that sort of come up over and over again is like, there's questions about spending per pupil in terms of like, are we spending too much? Are we spending too little? Is this the right amount? All of that. What right do different districts have to all of those things? But the other question that I have is when I think about what an equitable system looks like, or when I think about us doing long-term restructuring of education finance, and I'm sorry, Scott's not here because we've been talking about this a lot. Is like, what's the spread about spending per pupil? There are some districts that are spending so far below the state average, and there are some districts that are spending so far above the district average on spending per weighted pupil. And what does that actually mean about sort of access to education in Vermont? And if we make policy changes, are those policy changes that are going to widen the gap or policy changes that are going to narrow the gap? And so I thought it was helpful to look at what that gap actually is right now. Does that make sense?
Sure does.
Yes, but that's, there's so, when I think about it, I just think there's so much behind why the costs are what they are. Like what teacher pay is there, how old the staff is, all kinds of.
Mhm. Well, what's been
Culture.
interesting, culture. So what's been interesting in all the ways that I've asked JFO staff over the last 5 years to cut the data 1,000 different ways to find a correlation. They've never really found one. And I think Julia's done even more cutting of the data beyond what we've requested to try to find correlation. And have you found any?
I have struggled to find correlation. And I haven't found anything that is worth discussing here. So I guess no.
Yeah. So can you pull up the numbers and then discuss them? I think yeah.
So, as the chair noted, I was asked to put together a breakdown of the per pupil spending by district. This is reflecting the data that Nicole just presented, so that most recent round of data collections. And so this is that forecasted FY26.
And this is per weighted pupil, right?
Right, so
Should be
this is,
taken into account student needs already.
so this is the education spending divided by long-term weighted average daily membership, which is that metric we're using now. So this does include all of those weights of ELL, poverty, grades, etc. Again, caveats, it's reflecting forecasts. It doesn't reflect any voter approved budgets. So of course, per pupil spending is subject to change. I'm sorry, I'm seeing a typo right now. This should say FY25. So my apologies.
For a minute, you were about to like write on your computer.
I was about to. So what we're seeing here is the forecasted FY25 per pupil spending in these different buckets, so we can see a pretty wide range that doesn't have necessarily that perfect bell shape we're used to seeing or looking for. These are buckets of 500. And one other piece for context is, I know that there have been questions about calculating the averages within the data and what does that look like? So yeah, so there's different ways of thinking about calculating the average, right? So if we are looking at the mean, then there are still different ways that the mean could be calculated. One could be calculated by just weighting each district evenly and saying, we're going to calculate the mean of each district's ed spending per pupil, regardless of that district size, in which case the mean would be 13,440. If we were to do it by calculating at the whole state level, so we were to say, this is the state's total education spending, this is the state's total long-term weighted ADM, that would be 13,590, so up a bit. And then the median, when considering each district as one, regardless of size, the median is 13,440. So they're all kind of in.
Median doing as if the district is, as if the state's one district.
So that I wouldn't be able to calculate because
Oh, because
it's only one number.
but all in the 13,000.
Mhm.
I think when the median and mean are far apart from each other, or, I don't know, Julia can answer. I don't know the answer. Sorry.
I think it's showing that I think it's interesting to compare the mean at the state level and the mean as counting the district as one, because that's really saying that this is not going to be necessarily significantly skewed if you weren't weighting it by district size. So it's important, because it's saying that this is not all of your huge districts, and these are all of your small districts, because then you would see a very big difference between both means. So I think that that's really the interesting takeaway when coming at it from both ways, is you get a lot more insight into the breakdown of the size of the districts.
Ooh, everyone loved that.
Can you say that again, say that, and so, in the shortest possible way to say that, what was that? Just if I think I might have lost you.
I think I would say that this is showing your mean is not too far off from other ways that you could calculate it.
Representative Brannigan, then Demrow, then Sims, then Anthony.
Okay, so, when you put this chart together and you looked at the town of Sheldon, did you take their one number of their average per pupil cost? Or did you take each child in that district and say, okay, her cost, because she doesn't speak any English, is over here. And all of our high schools, so half our kids go here and half go there, and they have school choice. So is each child on here, or are these the average costs in one school district that you plotted?
So this is showing by each, so students are included here. All students in the state, all education spending in the state, that's all included in this graph. But the way that it's been included in this graph is it's saying for each district, so take a district, we're gonna calculate the education spending of that district. We calculate the long-term weighted ADM of the district. So that's all of the kids plus all of the weighted kids, EL, poverty, et cetera. And then we then take the education spending divided by the long-term weighted ADM, and that gives us the per pupil spending of the district,
Okay,
which on average is 13,440.
okay. 13,340,
440 when thinking about it that way.
okay. Do you know what the average per pupil cost statewide is? For one child?
So if it's per pupil, in statute, per pupil spending is including those weights, so that is it.
That's it. Well, so could a district look at their town report and see that their per pupil cost is 14,000 and say, oh, we're above state average?
Yes,
Be good, okay.
maybe I should have been a bit more precise in my language. Because districts are currently building their budgets, they may not know where they fall within the spectrum because everything is in flux, but they could look back a year at all of the districts' per pupil spending and look at the state per pupil spending average, and they could see exactly where they fell. But because we're in the middle of the budgeting cycle, budgets haven't been voted on yet, it's not fully clear.
This is a point in time of what Nicole was able to collect on warned budget data, right? This is not even voted budget.
Exactly. So if I had presented this same type of chart to you 2 weeks ago, it likely would look different because there were different data that we were using.
Thank you.
Representative Demmer.
Thank you, very much, Julia. Where my mind goes with this is I would love to see each district represented by a little block and those. And then the next place my mind goes is I'd love to see another graph with all those districts represented by the little blocks in the chart, but then to see by what percentage of votes their budget passes each year.
Oh.
I would like to see that too.
That is.
Can you make that, Carl?
Well, but then the problem with all this is at some point, there's too much noise to really get an accurate picture, right? And so, I mean, I think this is interesting from a spending standpoint, but as far as all the cultural stuff, all those other things that we talk about, it's just representative of what we spend. It's not representative of why or how. I guess that's what.
Before Julia jumps in, I just want to say, like, I've asked Julia to, when possible, with still integrity to the data, to not create charts that make it very specific which town is which and which
Sure,
district is which.
I understand.
Because I think
yeah.
it sends, it gets into a blame game, and there's a lot of blame going around these days. And so I just, like, as much as possible, when we can look at things that are slightly aggregated more, so we're not all pointing our fingers at whatever town we like to point our fingers at, the better off we are. But that's sort of an aside to your larger point, which I think is a really important one that I'm gonna.
Yeah, so I think that the question you're raising is a very interesting question. Why are district per pupil costs so varied, as we see in the histogram? And getting back to Chair Kornheiser's earlier remarks, I haven't been able to find an answer in the data that cleanly says the districts at the upper end all have this in common, and the districts in the middle all have that in common.
It's really
I don't
hard
know what it is.
when you really want answers to find clean data.
It is.
Yeah, no, I appreciate this, and it is nice to see that there's a big spread, but there is an average in the middle there that makes it look a little bit more normal.
Next was you. I wrote it down.
Oh,
Okay.
I'm curious, and you may not be able to answer this, whether one could or one has ever looked at this across geography or mapped with like poverty rates as I, think about other reasons that might influence, our type of pupil spending correlated with wealthier communities or not, or
Shockingly,
not.
not a correlation. So weird.
We've done, so someone has.
Like to death, yeah, during the development of waiting, but then after that for something else. Representative Anthony.
Thank you. If I can go back to one of the observations you made, or to reframe it a bit in your discussion of the mean versus the median. I think what I'm getting from your presentation, and you're slicing and dicing it in different ways, is the interesting fact that the size of districts does not appear to be in some way influencing the image we're seeing here. In other words, the large and small districts are distributed, I don't want to say randomly, but throughout the pattern. So the difference in the mean and median is really doesn't represent a skewness either by the number of students or the size of the district, which is interesting. Because then I conclude from that, I take away from that, then one could honestly say, look, there is a gathering around the center of what a large majority of people think is what we ought to deliver to Vermont students. Call it the average, call it the adequate, call it what you want. Doesn't appear to be skewed by anything that we should be suspect of. And back to Representative Demro's question, and I think that Chair Kornheiser mentioned this, the mystery is why certain districts, and Jeff Francis mentioned that during his Thursday discussion in the Ed Committee, some districts, regardless of size, are always at the low end. And you can chalk that up to culture, but culture is just a mystery block. You don't know really what's behind it, but you call it culture because it appears to be a sort of fixed pattern of behavior. But in my mind, it shouldn't be respected because we owe an adequate education to everybody in Vermont, regardless of what cultural bucket they come from, in my judgment.
And I think one of the next steps for me to better understand how this chart fits into meeting students' needs is to update Larry Picus's adequacy numbers to see how those numbers line up with what people are actually spending. Any other thoughts on this chart before we go to the new outlook? Okay.
Very cool.
One quick, what was the min and the max?
I don't have that in front of me.
It was 17 and change and 12 and change, I think.
So
Under
the,
under 10.
so the under 10
Oh,
and over 17,000, but how much under
Okay.
10 and how much over 17,000, I don't have.
that's right. With the 127 weights, it's altogether different than it used to be.
Yeah, so would you like me to share my,
Yes.
share the outlook? Okay.
And so Julia has been adding more and more columns every week on my request. And so before people get lost in the columns, I'm going to encourage us to pause in our thinking and just let her take us through actually some of the updates in the rows. Because there's some new information that's in this outlook as well as new modeling in the outlook. Does that make sense? Okay.
Is this a good size?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So a little bit bigger?
No, it's good. I should just go get some glasses.
I would recommend it.
It's really good.
You can see the words. It
Oh.
makes it easier.
Cool.
So this modeling reflects a couple of changes since I was in here last week. most significantly to the background modeling before getting into the different columns and iterations. The most significant change is the education payment amount. So this is now reflecting, showing what we have here. We've got the December column D. This is the December 1 outlook. Then this is the modeling that I presented last week or 2 weeks ago, in column E. And then column F is showing the updates to the current modeling and what's going on here. So what we see in terms of updates is that the education payment line has now come down it's come down since mid-January, since the last round of data that we have. So this is reflecting the data that Nicole just presented for the latest budget data. The other change is that we now have updated numbers from finance and management for the target for the stabilization reserve. So we need to raise about 4 million less based on changes that have happened in the BAA and updated calculations from finance and management. So that's technical, but I just want to flag that as the other change that I've made in the background when looking at the modeling.
Representative.
It's still roughly 5% though, after you made the adjustment.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so it still is filling the stabilization reserve to 5%. Thanks for the clarification. Really what the difference is that with changes in BAA and appropriations and whatnot, finance and management goes back and revisits what is exactly 5%. And so that's why it's come down a hair. So those are the two changes that I've made in the background that reflect the current status, the best available information that we have for the education fund. So I've also included the H850 transition, which is now law. So that's included in the modeling for the homestead and income rates. So what we see here is that with those changes, the decrease in the education payment and decrease in the money going to the stabilization reserve, we see that the yields have gone up. We see that the homestead yield has gone up a bit. We see that the income yield, it has gone down a bit, and that's because we've included the income discount, the discount from H850. So that's showing the discount for income rates of H850.
Discount what? What do you mean by that? Is that like my town got 13 cents
Correct.
back? Okay.
Yep. So there's the 13 cents, and then there's the corresponding discount on the income rates. That was another part of H850. So that's
Into income. Oh, yes, I know what you mean. Those who pay on income.
correct.
Yeah.
So the discount is for the homestead property tax rate and the tax rate for those who pay on income. So that's why you're seeing a change here, is because the modeling has been updated to reflect the way that income calculation may be determined by tax.
Thank you.
So what you see is that the average bill change compared to the prior year moved from about 20% from a couple weeks ago to now 19%, given those updates to the modeling and no other changes. Moving forward.
Representative.
And you have left the relative relationship between the non-homestead and the homestead the way it had historically played out.
I left it to be uniform.
Yeah,
Yes. Historically, not necessarily.
okay.
So
I know it has,
So
Okay.
it's a policy choice. It needs to be solved to be uniform for the December 1 letter. Beyond that, last year was uniform.
Yeah. okay.
And this goes back a spec, but which report are you talking about with Larry Pipes's report? His last report?
The adequacy report.
Dated one.
I don't know.
Most
Inside
recent?
it's inside the website, the JFO website.
Okay.
So then if we didn't hold everything uniform and we instead spent some time thinking, last week we talked about the income adjustment and how it's not really necessarily going to work as well this year because of the spike that we're seeing in tax rates, what would happen?
So first,
First you added the cloud tax, sorry.
first I was asked to add cloud tax, which would be, the current estimate is 20.4 million. For FY 2025, you'll recall that's an 11-month estimate. And including that as a revenue source that's uniformly applied to lowering all tax rates, is an average bill change of 17.6%. And then moving forward, shall I continue? And then moving forward to the question about changing the property tax credit. So we'll recall that the property tax credit, we spoke about how it's on a lag. So any changes that are made to the income yields this year won't be seen on property tax bills until people receive their FY 26 property tax bill because it's on a lag. So if there is going to be some adjustment made to the property tax credit that's seen on FY 25 bills, it can't be made through the income yield, but needs to be made to the property tax credit that's currently slated to be paid out in FY 25 based on FY 24.
Yes, Representative.
Is changing, and obviously I mean doing away with any and all of the lag. Is that administratively impossible for tax to do, or is it simply not the way we've done it in recent times?
I can't speak for the tax department.
Okay.
In informal conversations, it didn't seem like it would be an enormous lift.
But the calculation is known. It's not like it's not known. It's just, well,
I mean, I really would defer to tax. I will say that there are considerations with doing that, such as income is not known when you start paying your FY 25 tax bill. You don't know what your income was going to be. So that's just one piece that comes into my mind first.
Oh, and I'm sorry, I misunderstood what you were asking. Were you asking what would happen if we just moved to current year instead of?
yeah,
Oh, yes, there are all kinds of administrative concerns with that.
yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
sorry, huge administrative concerns with that. That's why we were talking about it's just increasing the percentage here because it also means that it doesn't tie us to doing that forever. It's something we could just do for 1 year.
So,
Because sorry, and because again, in order to figure out a way to actually get through this incredibly complex conversation, I've tried to put sort of certain blocks of parameters and decisions, right? And so one of them is we're likely going to have to tackle FY 25 with some short-term solutions while we work on FY 26 and out from there, right? And so this for me is this is an FY 25 solution. It's not necessarily a solution we would carry forward because in FY 26 and 27, we'll have more tools to do more complex work. Back to you, Julia.
all right. So, so I was asked to include modeling for increasing the property tax credit that would show up on FY 2025 bills. Excuse me. So this first column here, or I guess the next column H, is showing the just increasing the property tax credit by 10%. And this 10% because gives you some scale of reference. How much does it cost? What does it look like? So that's what this blue line here is showing. It's showing the one-time property tax credit increase. So if it were to be increasing by 15.8%, of course, that would be additional credit that would be going out to property taxpayers, which means less revenue collected, which means that money needs to be made up somewhere. So I was asked to hold the homestead yield constant to what it was in column G that we just looked at, but and put the increase on the non-homestead uniform rate. So that's what we see here. The homestead is still at 17.6. That's what we solved in column G. But now solving the non-homestead to make up that additional 15.8 million that needs to be raised puts us at a non-homestead bill increase of 19.6%. And then one final step of modeling that I was asked to do is to think about increasing the property tax credit so it in some ways sort of does away with the lag on tax bills of this year, right? So we're seeing the property tax bill increasing by projected to increase by 17.6% in this modeling.
So basically, like, we would be faking our way towards a single year adjustment that would mimic
Yeah.
us moving to current year
Very cool.
modeling.
Thank you.
Sure.
So that would be a 17. I base it off the average bill change, so that'd be a 17.6% increase in the property tax credit, which is $27.9 million. So again, that is money that needs to be raised. So that would, if it were to be raised on the non-homestead while holding the homestead constant, it would be an average bill increase on non-homestead of 21.14%.
Thoughts?
So what's,
I'm gonna go for Representative Masson and then Representative Bodie.
Well, this is all very interesting, and as you said, Madam Chair, we're manipulating columns in order to get to the desired outcome. If we can stomach it when we get there. I mean,
It's not even clear to me what the desired outcome is at this point.
pardon?
It's not entirely clear to me what the desired outcome is at this
Well,
point,
I was-
and so,
That was in quotations.
Yeah,
I
no.
understand that this is an exercise
Mhm.
in trying to figure out, you know, if we shade things one way or shade things the other way, benefits and does not. We're using the same money.
yeah. Okay, and I'll just mention, so on Thursday, towards that, what the desired outcome is question, and the idea that we need some parameters in front of us to make this decision well, so we're not just like, you know, shooting darts towards some imaginary tax rate that we find acceptable. I've asked the Superintendent's Association, the School Boards Association, and the NEA to come in on Thursday and tell us not what they want us to do, but what they think we should be considering or prioritizing as we make the decisions for this year and for out years. Representative Odie, you had a thought on, no? Okay, Representative Anthony.
Thank you very much. I'll repeat an observation I've made that no one has said is wrongheaded, namely that the way grand lists have moved around does not conform to a uniform change between homestead and non-homestead, knowing as I do that non-homestead is a big bucket of all kinds of different activities. Homestead is pretty clear as to what it is. So I am very open to saying in this kind of exigency, we have to think about not moving them uniformly, and because the big hit and the big, if you will, untransferable burden is on the homestead side. I think it would be wise to consider moving the non-homestead at a higher rate than the homestead. And to cover that, the spreadsheet we now have incorporates the cloud, which is something we've all talked about for 6 years anyway, maybe 5. And lastly, I'd have to say I really, because of the dramatic movement in property valuations entirely that are not replicated in the way incomes have moved, I think the idea of moving the credit is very imaginative, as if it's mimicking us trying to correct for the fact that the income credit is a year lagged. But this is a year that's so unusual, it would be nice to even that out. I guess that's the way to say it, in my opinion. So I'm awed, impressed, and tantalized by a lot of the latter choices in the far column. I don't know how else to put it.
Representative Meadows?
I'm just curious, Peter, about homestead is more burden than the non-homestead. What do you mean by that?
Did I say that? I said it's more varied.
I heard more burden too.
Yeah,
And I was also curious.
I don't know what.
CLA,
I mean, if you live in your homestead, there's no one you can pass your property taxes on to. Is that what you meant?
Well, if you don't live in your homestead, you can still pass that property tax on your investment. on.
I am concerned with burdening renters in the context of all of this. And that's like if.
Or
I
stores
think
that are
that's,
struggling.
or stores that are struggling. I think those are all questions to consider as well. Representative Manos, do you have further?
No, I was just curious about that. That's all.
Representative Anthony, do you have a question, an answer? Or? No, okay. Representative Sims.
It's not surprising, but just discouraging how adding 20 million moves the needle so little. It
Indeed.
just continues to reinforce what we've been feeling all along, that the magnitude of this challenge is
Magnitudinous.
enormous. Yeah, we're sure hoping that Nicole would say revised budgets are going to be down 50 million.
I will say that, so the next,
We'll take 15, but yeah, let's hope it continues to iterate in the coming weeks.
and again, the updates that we have in the outlook are not, as Julia said, they're not just from revised budgets. They're also from corrections within AOE on other data. The next time we look at an outlook will be after town meeting day. And I'll say for the record, for anyone who's tuning in, I've gotten a bunch of questions from school boards or people asking on behalf of school boards, what yield should we look at? What yield is Ways and Means recommending? And I don't have an answer to that. Historically, districts looked at the December 1st outlook. And historically, we have looked at a new outlook every 2 weeks from that day forward until we pass the yield. And this year is no different. I understand that instability on top of instability is an impossible situation. It's a situation that we're all in.
Do you want to encourage everyone who cares deeply about this issue to show up at town meeting day and weigh in on their budgets?
I think that the promise of the education fund and the way we structure all of this is that voters are deeply attuned to what's happening in their districts and understanding the system. And that only works when people participate and ask questions and actually seek to understand what's going on. Julia, I have like a vague memory of you having a hand, but no, okay. Any other thoughts on this modeling here? Any next steps that people would like to see? Okay, it is a relatively short day here in Ways and Means. And tomorrow, it was a lot of information to digest. So please feel free to stay here and just keep on looking at all of the information that Nicole and Julia shared with us in order to synthesize it. If you have questions for Julia, she can stay in the chair and we can stay live. I thought so too. Not on you. Do you have?
Sorry, I can wait till tomorrow.
No,
I
you
just have some basic questions about the chart. Like there's on FY 24, the BAA number for line small d, property yield per pupil is 15,400. And then in column D and E, it's significantly lower. Why?
Great question. That's because of the change in weighting formula. So in FY 24, we were using equalized pupils. So it was the education spending per equalized pupil divided by the yield. And then equalized pupils, essentially what that meant was applied all the weights and then used an equalization ratio to bring the weighted pupils back down to the number of kids in the state. And starting with Act 127, there's no longer an equalization ratio that's being used. So the long-term weighted ADM count is much larger, which means that the yield also, the yield needs to become much smaller in order to account for that change in methodology. So essentially, it means that the two are not directly comparable, because trying to compare the yield from FY24 to the yield in FY25 is essentially comparing apples to oranges because of the change in weighting formula and the way that pupils are ultimately being included in the calculation.
So, apples to oranges, are we talking about line D is the apples to oranges?
Correct.
Yeah, okay.
Line D and line E. And I actually do have a footnote there. If you look at the bottom, that says that in 2 sentences.
Okay.
And I'm aware that it's very small. Because we've now shifted the orientation of the page.
Okay. Okay, what else should I know about that first block of data?
FY 2024? Is that what you mean by the first block of data?
Yeah, I mean lines A through J.
I would encourage folks, when you're looking at each updated outlook that we look at, Julia did make that guide to looking at the outlook, which I saw Carol have it. Carol, you printed it out huge, didn't you? And it's like
Yes.
somewhere.
And
So maybe you can find it after we're done.
I will.
Okay.
and I'll have.
Oh, look at that.
That'd be nice to
Okay.
have.
So encourage people to use that when you're looking at this after we recess. Thank you, Julia.
Sure.
So tomorrow, we are going to, in a lot of ways, have a judiciary committee day. We're looking at 3 different bills that were sent over from the judiciary committee. 2 about trusts and 1 about restorative justice that has a fee in it. We're going to look at an amendment that Representative Anthony has helped draft on H10, which is a bill that was referred to us last year and we didn't pick up before crossover. It's over there on referred House bills. That's the veggie bill. And then we're going to hear an amendment on 629 from the GovOps committee, who have spent a little bit more time on 629. That's the tax sale bill. And then here an update to 679, which is a bill that Representative Stevens sponsored that did not have a lot of flesh on the bones. And I have asked Kirby to put some flesh on the bones of that bill. That's that's sort of updating the property transfer tax that didn't have any inflators in it. And so we've sort of added some inflators. And so it'll be a full day of jumping from one thing to the next tomorrow. See you then at 9.